The world is changing right in front of our eyes, and most people have no idea what just happened. While America's Navy was busy blockading the Strait of Hormuz, while CNN was showing aircraft carriers and destroyers patrolling the Persian Gulf, while the entire Western media was focused on military might and power projection, Xi Jinping was playing a completely different game. And here's the terrifying part for Washington. China just won without firing a single shot. Let me take you back to a specific moment. 21 hours of negotiations in Islamabad. The United States deploying its naval assets to one of the most strategic choke points in the world. Oil prices spiking to $103 per barrel. European allies beginning to distance themselves from American strategy. And in the middle of all this chaos, all this tension, all this brinkmanship, Xi Jinping was absolutely silent. Not a statement, not a condemnation, not even a tweet. Nothing. And that silence? That was the most powerful move on the chessboard. You see, there's a concept in game theory called strategic patience. It's the idea that sometimes the most powerful action is inaction. Let your opponent exhaust themselves. Let them make mistakes. Let them reveal their hand. Let them burn through their resources, their credibility, their alliances. And then, when they're stretched thin, when they're vulnerable, when they've committed everything to one strategy, that's when you make your move. And that's exactly what China did. Think about what was happening from America's perspective. The United States had committed significant naval resources to the Middle East. They were enforcing a blockade. They were making a statement about power. They were showing the world that America still controls the global commons, that America still dictates the terms of international security. But here's the problem with blockades. They're expensive. Not just financially, though moving carrier strike groups halfway around the world cost millions of dollars per day. They're expensive politically. They're expensive diplomatically. Every day that blockade continues, every ship that gets turned away, every barrel of oil that doesn't reach its destination, that's another relationship strained, another ally questioning American judgment, another neutral country wondering if there might be a better way. And oil hit $103 per barrel. Now, for Americans filling up their gas tanks, that's painful. For Europeans already dealing with energy crises, that's catastrophic. For developing nations trying to recover from economic downturns, that's potentially devastating. And who gets blamed for that? Not Iran, not the theoretical threat. The country enforcing the blockade, the United States. Because in the court of global public opinion, the country that stops the oil from flowing is the country that caused the problem. Then came the really damaging part. The United Kingdom, America's closest ally, the so-called special relationship, started expressing reservations. Not outright opposition, not yet, but questions, concerns, suggestions that perhaps there might be diplomatic solutions worth exploring. And if the UK is questioning American strategy, you can bet every other European nation is having the same conversation behind closed doors. That's the cost of a blockade. That's the price of military solutions in a world that's grown weary of military solutions. And that's when Xi Jinping struck. Not with missiles or ships or threats, with a handshake, with agreements, with economic partnerships and technological cooperation and infrastructure deals. While American admirals were coordinating naval patrols, Xi Jinping was sitting down with the Crown Prince of the United Arab Emirates. And what they were discussing wasn't military alliances or security guarantees. It was artificial intelligence. It was energy corridors. It was the future of the Middle East economy. It was everything that matters for the next 50 years. Let's talk about what that UAE deal actually means, because this is where the game theory gets really interesting. The United States and Israel have been working on their own corridor, the India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor. It was announced with great fanfare. It was supposed to be the answer to China's Belt and Road Initiative. It was supposed to cement American influence in the region for generations. It was supposed to show that the West could offer an alternative to Chinese investment. And it could have worked. It should have worked, except for one problem. While America was focused on military power, China was focused on making that corridor irrelevant. You don't have to destroy your opponent's strategy if you can simply make it obsolete. That's advanced game theory. That's thinking 3 moves ahead. China isn't trying to compete with the US-Israel corridor. China is building something that makes the US-Israel corridor unnecessary. Artificial intelligence partnerships mean UAE becomes a tech hub connected to Chinese innovation ecosystems. Energy corridors mean oil and gas flow through Chinese-financed infrastructure. Investment in ports and logistics means Chinese yuan becomes an increasingly acceptable currency for regional trade. This isn't competition, this is replacement. And here's where it gets even more sophisticated. China is offering something the United States cannot offer right now: predictability. Think about what the Middle East has experienced from American foreign policy over the past 2 decades. Invasions and withdrawals, commitments and abandonments, alliances that shift with every administration, red lines that turn out not to be red lines, strategic pivots that leave former partners wondering where they stand. The Middle East has learned a hard lesson. American guarantees are only good until the next election, until the next crisis, until the next shift in domestic political winds. China doesn't have that problem. Not because China is more trustworthy or more moral or more committed to the region, but because China's interests are more straightforward. China needs energy. China needs markets. China needs stability for its investments. Those interests don't change with elections because there are no elections. Those interests don't shift with public opinion because public opinion doesn't determine foreign policy. For better or worse, and I'm not making a judgment here, I'm just explaining the game theory, China can offer something that looks an awful lot like reliability. Now let's talk about that statement Xi Jinping made. The world order is crumbling. A lot of people heard that as rhetoric, as propaganda, as the kind of thing authoritarian leaders say to make themselves sound important. But let me offer you a different interpretation. That wasn't a boast. That was a signal. And it wasn't directed at Washington. It was directed at the global South, at Africa, at Latin America, at Southeast Asia, at every region that has spent the past 70 years living under an American-designed international system and wondering if there might be alternatives. This is pure game theory, specifically what's called signaling in strategic games. When you make a public statement, you're not just communicating information, you're revealing your intentions. You're coordinating expectations. You're telling potential allies what game you're playing and inviting them to join. Xi Jinping was telling the developing world, the American era is ending. The rules are changing. And if you want to be on the winning side of history, now is the time to make your choice. And here's why that signal matters. International relations isn't a two-player game. It's not just America versus China. It's a massive multiplayer game with dozens of significant actors and hundreds of smaller players. And most of them are trying to figure out which great power to align with, which partnerships to pursue, which economic blocs to join. For decades, that choice was easy. America was the richest country, the strongest military, the most dynamic economy. Aligning with America meant access to markets, protection from threats, and participation in the global system. But what happens when that's no longer obviously true? What happens when America looks distracted, overstretched, unreliable? What happens when China is offering comparable economic benefits with fewer political strings attached? You get a shift. Not overnight, not dramatically, but country by country, decision by decision, investment by investment, the center of gravity begins to move. And that's what Xi Jinping's statement was about. He was accelerating that shift. He was giving permission to countries that were already thinking about hedging their bets, already wondering about alternatives, already calculating the cost and benefits of the American alliance. Now, let's address the elephant in the room. The United States blockade wasn't just hurting Iran. It had the potential to hurt China. A significant percentage of China's oil imports come through the Strait of Hormuz. If America can shut down that strait, if America can control who ships what to whom, that's a knife at China's throat. That's leverage. That's the kind of geographic advantage that has determined the outcome of great power competitions throughout history. So how is China not terrified of this? How is Xi Jinping playing offense when he should be playing defense? The shadow fleet. This is one of the most fascinating and least discussed aspects of the new global energy market. Over the past few years, China, working with Iran, Russia, and a network of smaller partners, has built an entire parallel shipping infrastructure. These are vessels that turn off their transponders. They transfer cargo ship to ship in international waters. They use shell companies and complex ownership structures that make it almost impossible to determine who actually controls them. They operate in the gray zone between legal commerce and sanctions evasion, and there are hundreds of them. The United States knows about this. American intelligence agencies track these vessels. The Treasury Department issues sanctions. The State Department makes complaints. But here's the thing about the shadow fleet. It's really hard to stop. You can't blockade ships you can't track. You can't interdict cargo you can't prove exists. You can't sanction companies that exist only on paper in third countries. The shadow fleet isn't a perfect solution for China. It's more expensive than normal shipping. It's riskier. It involves dealing with some fairly unsavory partners. But it's a backup. It's insurance. It's a way of making sure that American naval power, impressive as it is, can't actually strangle the Chinese economy. And here's where the game theory gets really dark for America. The harder the United States pushes the blockade, the more countries will turn to alternatives. The shadow fleet grows. Alternative payment systems develop. Yuan-based oil trading expands. Every country in the Middle East that looks at American blockades and thinks, I need to make sure I'm not vulnerable to this, becomes a potential Chinese partner. America is creating the very problem it's trying to prevent. The blockade meant to demonstrate power is demonstrating limitations. The strategy meant to contain China is pushing neutral countries toward Chinese alternatives. This is what's called a strategic trap in game theory. It's a situation where your natural response to a threat actually makes the threat worse. America sees Chinese influence growing in the Middle East, so America demonstrates military power. That demonstration of military power makes America look aggressive and unreliable. That perception pushes Middle Eastern countries toward China. Chinese influence grows. America feels more threatened. America demonstrates more military power. The cycle continues. And the whole time, China doesn't have to do anything except offer an alternative. China doesn't have to defeat America. China just has to be there when countries start looking for options. Let me paint you a picture of what this looks like in practice. It's 2025, maybe 2026. A Middle Eastern country, let's say Saudi Arabia for the sake of argument, needs to make a decision about a major infrastructure project. 20 years ago, that would have been an American contract, financed by American banks, built by American companies with American security guarantees. 10 years ago, it might have been a competition, American firms versus European firms, with some Chinese companies bidding on smaller pieces. Today, the Chinese bid is competitive on price. The Chinese have a track record of finishing projects on time. The Chinese aren't going to ask uncomfortable questions about human rights or democracy or social reforms. And the Chinese are offering to finance the whole thing in yuan, which means Saudi Arabia doesn't have to worry about dollar exposure or American sanctions or Federal Reserve policy. What does Saudi Arabia choose? Maybe they still go with America. History matters. Relationships matter. There are reasons to prefer the devil you know. But maybe they don't. Maybe they split the contract. Maybe they give the big infrastructure piece to China and throw America a smaller consolation project. And once that precedent is set, once it becomes normal for major Middle Eastern countries to have strategic partnerships with China that don't include America, the game has fundamentally changed. And it's not just Saudi Arabia. It's the UAE, which just signed these AI and energy deals. It's Egypt, which is part of Belt and Road. It's Iraq, which is rebuilding with Chinese investment. It's Pakistan, which has made itself almost entirely dependent on Chinese infrastructure financing. Country by country, decision by decision, the Middle East is becoming less exclusively American and more genuinely multipolar. And the thing is, I don't think America knows how to operate in a multipolar Middle East. American strategy for 70 years has been based on dominance. American alliances, American security guarantees, American-led coalitions, American weapons systems, American diplomatic frameworks. What happens when that's just one option among several? This is what Xi Jinping meant when he said the world order is crumbling. Not that China is building a new order to replace the American order, though maybe they are, but that the order itself, the idea that one country sets the rules and everyone else follows them, that structure is breaking down. And in the chaos of that breakdown, in the uncertainty of that transition, China sees opportunity. Because chaos favors the adaptive, uncertainty favors those who can offer stability, transition favors those who are building the future rather than defending the past. Think about the position America is in right now. Massive national debt, political polarization that makes long-term strategy almost impossible, allies that are increasingly willing to disagree publicly, adversaries that have learned how to exploit American weaknesses without triggering overwhelming American responses, an electorate that's tired of foreign interventions and skeptical of international commitments. And in the middle of all that, America is trying to maintain a global order built for a different era, with different assumptions, under different conditions. China doesn't have to be better than America. China doesn't have to be more innovative or more dynamic or more appealing. China just has to be functional while America is distracted. China just has to be present while America is overstretched. China just has to offer an alternative while American reliability is in question. That's not a high bar, and China is clearing it. The UAE deal is a perfect example. What did China actually offer? Investment in artificial intelligence, which the UAE wants because oil won't last forever and they need to diversify their economy. Energy corridor development, which creates infrastructure that will be useful regardless of global political shifts. Economic partnerships that don't require the UAE to choose sides in every international dispute. From the UAE's perspective, this is just smart hedging. From China's perspective, this is strategic positioning. From America's perspective, this should be alarming because it represents a country that used to be automatically in the American camp, now actively building alternatives. And here's the really tricky part for American strategy. What can America actually do about this? Threaten the UAE? That pushes them further toward China. Offer a better deal? With what money? Approved by which Congress? Under what conditions? Increase military presence? That makes America look more aggressive, not more attractive. The usual tools of American statecraft don't work well in this situation. You can't sanction your allies for talking to your competitors. You can't invade your way to economic partnerships. You can't blockade your way to technological cooperation. This is the trap Xi Jinping has set. Every move America makes to counter Chinese influence either costs more than America can afford or backfires diplomatically. The blockade in the Strait of Hormuz is costing America credibility with allies, pushing oil prices higher, making America look like the problem rather than the solution, and creating exactly the kind of instability that drives countries to look for alternatives. And the alternative standing there, patient and ready, is China. Let me be very clear about what I'm saying and what I'm not saying. I'm not saying China is going to replace America as the global hegemon. I'm not saying the American era is over. I'm not predicting Chinese dominance for the next century. What I'm saying is much more specific and much more immediate. In the Middle East, right now, China has outmaneuvered the United States. Not through military force, not through superior technology, not through some brilliant masterstroke, but through basic game theory, through patience, through offering alternatives, through being present and engaged while America was distracted and overstretched. The wait and bleed strategy worked. America exhausted itself, damaged its own credibility, and created the opening China needed. The UAE bypass is working. China is building infrastructure and partnerships that make American regional frameworks less relevant. The zero-sum signal is working. Countries around the world are watching this play out and adjusting their strategies accordingly. The shadow fleet is working. Chinese energy security no longer depends entirely on American goodwill or American-controlled sea lanes. This is what defeat looks like in the 21st century. Not explosions and invasions, not surrenders and occupations, just a slow, steady erosion of influence. Just a gradual shift in who countries call first when they need a partner. Just an incremental movement in the global balance of power. And by the time you realize it's happened, by the time the loss becomes undeniable, it's already too late to reverse it easily. The question now isn't whether China outplayed America in the Middle East. The question is, what happens next? Does America adapt? Does American strategy evolve to compete in this new environment? Or does America double down on the approaches that aren't working? The military demonstrations and the blockades and the demands for loyalty. Because if it's the latter, Xi Jinping has already won. The trap is set. America just has to keep walking into it.